Hi Year 10, how are you? I hope you've had a really lovely half term. I hope you've been enjoying the sunshine and looking forward to seeing you soon. Should be back in school having some face-to-face lessons, which will be lovely very soon. So looking forward to that. I'm going to do a lesson with you today on microbes. We're going to look at different types of microorganism and we're going to look at some examples, some named examples. We're going to look at their structure and we're going to look at these named examples of particular microbes that you need to know. Obviously really topical at the moment with all the business about coronavirus in the news, and we will be talking about viruses later on in the lesson. So I hope you've got a pen, something to write with, ready to jot down anything I need you to jot down, piece of paper or your book hopefully, and we'll make notes as we go. Okay, so obviously micro means very small living thing for an organism, so that's what the word means. Some of these you can see quite easily under a normal light microscope like we have in school, and some of them obviously you'll need. They're very, very tiny, like viruses for example, so you would need an electron microscope to be able to view these. So we're going to look particularly at what pathogens are. Very interested in pathogens. Now pathogens are disease causing microbes. I'd like you to jot that down, so you need to pause the video. So a pathogen is a disease causing microbe. Now it's really important to know the majority of microbes that we meet every day are completely harmless to us, and in fact most are actually very helpful to us. They're very useful. For example, your gut is teeming with bacteria that can digest the fibre that you can't digest in your food, releasing really useful compounds that are really good for you. In return for you obviously giving them somewhere to live and some food, but the products that they make from breaking down the food that you can't break down, the fibre, is actually really useful. There are lots of examples of what we call friendly flora. That's microbes that actually grow, like in your gut for example. They live there, and being there stops harmful ones from actually being able to grow and take over. So they're actually really useful. Microbes are everywhere, so they're on your skin, on your hair, in your mouth, on the surfaces you touch. They're in the air, on your toothbrush, on your comb, absolutely everywhere. We call them ubiquitous. They're absolutely everywhere. But as I said, the vast majority cause you no harm. A lot of them are really good for us. They're very helpful, and only a very small number cause harm, and that's the pathogens. So we're going to look at a very small number. So I don't want you to go worrying about pathogens, especially as what's on our news all the time at the moment about coronavirus. So pathogens are disease-causing microbes. Hopefully you've jotted that down. So we're going to look firstly at bacteria. Bacteria are single-celled organisms. They're much smaller than plant and animal cells. Remember we've looked at plant and animal cells before. Remember you've got your eukaryotic cells. You meaning true nucleus. They're the cells that your plant and animal cells that have a nucleus. They'll have a membrane-bound nucleus. They'll have organelles and so on. Whereas prokaryotic, pro means before nucleus, these cells don't have a nucleus, and bacteria obviously fall into these prokaryotic cells. So they don't have a nucleus with the DNA, and their genetic information, the DNA, is free floating in the nucleus or in little tiny circles called plasmids. We'll talk about those later maybe. So they're single celled. You would be able to see a lot of these under your normal light microscope. They are smaller than animal and plant cells, and we would be able to see some of these. The largest bacteria is 10 micrometers long, so that's 10 millionths of a meter, really tiny. Some bacteria cause disease, as I said, but many are harmless, many are very useful. And sometimes the way they cause disease, it could be that they release a toxin that makes you ill. That would be classic in food poisoning. Sometimes somebody might reheat food and they might think, oh, it's okay, even though I've left it out and it's sort of been not covered over, or it's been reheated several times, or whatever reason you shouldn't be eating it. People think, oh, it's okay, I'll heat it really hot, I'll blast it, get it really hot, and I know it will kill any bacteria that are there. Yes, it will kill the bacteria, quite right, but it won't kill the toxins, and the toxins are like the poisons that can make you ill. So sometimes it's the bacteria and what the bacteria are doing in your body that make you ill. So they may be reproducing, bursting out of your cells and so on, and causing damage to your cells. Other times it may be that they're releasing a toxin that causes harm. So bacterial cells, the characteristics, they are obviously, we just said that they are prokaryotic cells. They will have a cell wall. They do not have a nucleus. Their DNA is in the cytoplasm, and they lack organelles. They generally lack organelles. They will reproduce asexually. Now there is an exception to an organelle that you'd find in bacterial cells. So you would find ribosomes where proteins are made. Other than that, you won't find the normal organelles, like, for example, a nucleus that you would have in an animal cell, for example, or a plant cell. So they reproduce asexually. That means they'll make identical copies. They'll split and make two daughter cells. They'll make identical copies. They don't need a second bacteria to do that, and they will actually reproduce quite very, very quickly. Every 20 minutes, for example, they may double in their numbers. So they have a very exponential growth rate, and I'll show you that in a minute. Looking at their structure then, this is quite a simple diagram here. So you've got a cell wall, that would be drawn as the outer line, and then you've got your cell membrane, the next line in. Notice there's no nucleus. You will find, obviously, there's a cytoplasm. Plasmids are these little tiny circles of DNA, and these are a good way of sharing genetic information with other bacteria. What they can do is they can actually form, it's a little bit like a gap here with the next bacteria, and they can actually send through the plasmid and send through genetic information. I'll show you how that's done rather than me waffling away. I will show you that on a separate slide later, how that happens. But this is genetic information. You'll find the ribosomes, that's the only organelle you'll have. And also you'll have free-floating big circle of DNA here as well, but remember, no nucleus. They come in quite a lot of shapes and sizes. So you've got, note how tiny we're talking. So we'll talk about micrometers here. We've got circular bacterial cells. These, what we call these circles, cocci. So you've heard of things like Staphylococcus, Streptococcus or Streptococci. They're circular or like spheres, are those particular bacteria. Then you can have rod-shaped bacteria, and they'll have the name of bacilli. So you've probably heard of lactobacilli. You have that in yogurt. That's a rod-shaped bacteria. And then you've got these spiral bacteria here, and obviously note their sizes. Some of the diseases you need to know that are linked to bacterial infections, or caused by bacterial infections. This is one. This is a gonorrhea, sexually transmitted disease. It causes all sorts of problems. Obviously, it's passed on through unprotected sex. Infected kidneys, urinary tract problems, inflammation, swelling, discharge, all sorts of problems with gonorrhea. And there are long-term problems with gonorrhea as well, with your reproductive system. So abdominal pain, it's really not very nice. This is one that sort of years ago used to hear of a lot, but it is actually still around, and still is obviously a big worry if people are having unprotected sex. It can be passed on that way. And the reason I say it's a worry, it seems to be something that's sort of seen a lot more now, and it had gone down in numbers, is because it's actually starting to become very resistant to the antibiotic that was used to treat it. And we'll talk about antibiotic resistance another time, but the antibiotics that are given to treat this horrible illness are not working anymore. And so you have to try and find other antibiotics, and sometimes they're very ineffective, and so that makes it quite hard to treat. So that's definitely best one to avoid by obviously using a condom. I talked to you about the growth rate, and as you can see, here's the number of cells at the side and the time along the bottom, and you can see this growth rate going on here. So it's doubling, isn't it? Okay, so notice, let's have a little look. Every hour it's doubling. Yes, that's right. So have a little think about what we call that type of growth. You would have done about that in maths. Okay, so viruses are very strange. In theory, viruses are not living things because they can't do any of the life processes on their own. They can't survive outside or reproduce, should I say, outside of your body's cell machinery. It needs your cells to be able to reproduce. It needs your body's cell, your body's machinery to be able to reproduce. It can't do the 7 life processes without that. So viruses often fall into this category where we say they're not living. They're really genetic information surrounded in a protein coat, and their sole way of spreading is obviously getting into your cells and using your cell's machinery to reproduce, and then obviously bursting out of the cell, killing the cell, in the meantime making many more copies of itself. But it can't do that without your cells. So microscopic, we're talking way smaller than bacteria, really, very tiny. We would not be able to see that under a school microscope. They're smaller than bacteria. They have some really unusual shapes. I'll show you in a minute. I sometimes think when you look at the shapes of them, they almost look like alien ships or kind of like spacecraft or something. They're really strange. So they infect the host to reproduce. They can only replicate inside living organisms, and they'll kill those cells as they do that. They're more difficult to treat than bacterial infections as they're able to adapt to your immune responses. So I would jot down a couple of notes about what a virus is. So pause the video, make sure you've written down that they're smaller than bacteria, and that obviously they need your cell's machinery to be able to reproduce. So that's viruses. I need to if I just jump back to the bacteria, I'm not sure if I asked you to make some notes on that as well. So just jot down a couple of basic things about the bacteria that I've said to you. It could be that they are single-celled organisms, that they are smaller than animal and plant cells. Most are harmless. I think a good point to add would be that they don't have a nucleus, and their DNA is free-floating or in plasmids, these little circles of DNA. So do make notes on that. I don't know if I said that or not. So we're jumping back to viruses. We were looking at viruses, and I asked you to make just some very basic notes of what they are. So this is another example of a virus. Notice they've got there's a protein coat. They have these proteins on their surface that are unique to that virus. Your immune system will make antibodies to fit these shapes. It will be very specific. But this is the bit that the virus is trying to pass on. It's the genetic information. Here are some examples of viruses. I said they were very odd looking, didn't I? I always think these ones here, they look like a little spaceship. So these are families of viruses or types of viruses. Papillomavirus, this is the one that you guys probably got vaccinated against, possibly year 8 or 9. For that was human papillomavirus can lead to cervical cancer. So there's a vaccination program there. Ebola, probably heard of Ebola. It's a hemorrhagic fever virus. Basically liquefies your organs, really nasty. That's one that you find in jungles of places off the beaten track, for example. You wouldn't find it in, definitely not in the UK, definitely not any touristy places, but if you were sort of trekking out in the back of beyond in some very far away country, somewhere in maybe Africa, for example, you could come across this. And then we've got things like flu, hepatitis, and so on. So they've got some really unusual shapes. Okay, so this is one you will need to know about. We'll talk about this later. Tobacco mosaic virus, that's one. This one you probably all had, flu. Okay, and just for interest, this one is a model of coronavirus, and I'm sure you've seen pictures of that on the news quite a lot lately. So as I said, a virus will enter the cell. It will obviously deliver its little package of genetic information. This is obviously not to scale, way out. The virus will replicate itself using the cell's machinery, and then it will burst out all these copies of more virus that then will be passed on, probably through something like coughing or sneezing. Here's a very famous virus that you would have heard of, so HIV. That obviously attacks and affects the immune system. Another one here is measles, very contagious, something that I had as a child. You wouldn't probably get this, you don't really hear of it anymore because you guys have had MMR, I would imagine, measles, mumps and rubella. So you just don't really hear of measles anymore because of a vaccination program. When I was young, everybody at some point picked up measles. It spread through droplet transmission, so from coughs and sneezes. When you're talking to somebody up close, there's droplets on your breath, and it causes a fever, horrible spots, really itchy spots, a little bit like chicken pox, sore throat, skin rash, and so on. It's not very nice at all. So that's another example for a virus. If we look at the plant world, this is tobacco mosaic virus. This is one you do need to know about. It infects a wide range of plants, especially tobacco and other members of that family. It causes this mottling kind of discoloration you can probably see here on the leaves. It was the first virus to be discovered, known from the late 19th century. They knew something non-bacterial was damaging the crops, but it was not until 1930 that the infectious agent was determined to be a virus. So first pathogen identified as a virus. So you need to know this one. So this is in plants, and it causes this mottling. So obviously it's going to affect photosynthesis because there's less green on that leaf. If we jump to fungi, bigger than viruses and bacteria, though many, they're still single-celled organisms. They grow in very thin, like threads. We call these hyphae. Through whatever they're living on. So it could be through soil, could be on the surface of skin and so on, but with these little microscopic threads called hyphae. Now when we think of fungi, we think of things like mushrooms, and we think of that typical sort of toadstooly shape or a mushroom shape. That's just the fruiting body. That means that is just when it's reproducing, you see that. That's the reproductive stage of fungi. But the rest of the time, the fungus is still there, but it's growing in these microscopic threads that you probably wouldn't see. They'd be in the soil, for example. It's only when they come to reproduce you see the typical sort of mushroom or fungus that we all think of. They can cause disease by destroying the living cells. Some are very useful, like yeast, for example, really, really useful. Mushrooms that we eat and so on. This isn't too much fun though. This is athlete's foot caused by fungus. Anywhere sort of damp and warm, sweaty and wet in between the toes. If you don't wash and dry you can get athlete's foot. So that's a reason to wash and dry your feet. So this is what I mean. So they grow in these little very tiny microscopic threads. You wouldn't see these because look at the size. And you'd see these, if there's a lot of them, a lot of the threads sort of bunched together, you might see them. But individually, they're too tiny. This is what they look when they reproduce. But this is the structure that I'm talking about. It's these hyphae, fungal mycelium. Now, if you eat corn, so if you might be vegetarian or you might just like corn products. Corn products are basically these hyphae, these threads, this fungal mycelium. It's sort of grown and then bunched and packed together to make corn. So we can look at that another time, how corn is made. It's quite interesting. So the hyphae are thin strands of cells that make up the fungus body. And the bit that grows above the ground, obviously I said that's the fruiting body. And underneath here, you get spores that then come off. They drop down, these little microscopic spores, and then they'll start growing off the next thread and another fungus. Okay. So the spores are on the underneath. This is what we call the cap. You've got the spores, and then obviously these microscopic hyphae. We talk about plants. Rose black spot is a fungus that actually attacks, as you can see, plants like rose bushes and causes these black spots. So if you have a look, if you've got any roses in your garden, have a little look and see if they've got any black spots like that. They could be infected with a fungus. So obviously you can't see it, but there could be a fungus causing problems with your rose bush. And then lastly, we've got these protists, pathogens. These are single-celled organisms. The most obvious one that you've probably heard of before would be one that causes malaria. We'll look at that in a minute. So we've got this one. So they're single-celled organisms. They're really tiny. You obviously need a microscope. This causes African sleeping sickness. This one here, you find this sometimes in dirty swimming pools, for example, and it can cause horrible diarrhea. So they're single-celled organisms, but can you see these like long, like thread-like structures on them? And look at the size, very, very tiny. Now, malaria is one that you would have heard of. So remember if you get bit by a mosquito, they're like flying syringes. They basically spit in your blood, and in their saliva, in their mouthpiece, they're carrying this protozoa, which then gets into your red blood cells and multiply, which means your red blood cells can't carry oxygen. So you can see here, instead of carrying oxygen, lovely red blood cell is now packed full of horrible parasites that cause malaria. And that's because of this fella. Here is the life cycle, just for your interest, of the malaria parasite. So we start off with these, they're like spores. Let's have a little look. Obviously we've got reproduction over here. Do you know what, looking at this, I don't think you need the details of this, so I'm going to skip. Okay, so we've looked at quite a few different illnesses caused by pathogens. These are the ones in red are caused by bacteria, the ones in green are caused by viruses, and the one in blue is a fungus, and the one in purple is a protozoa or a protoctist. What I would like you to do is just make some very brief notes on each one. Okay, so I want to know just a couple of facts on salmonella, food poisoning or salmonella, a couple of facts on gonorrhea, and you might get that off my slide. A couple of facts of measles, again, you'll get that on my slide. A couple of facts of these others. Again, look on my slide or look things up. So I'd like you to maybe draw a table, and in that table you can write down, I'm just trying to see if I've got a table for you or not. No, I don't. We need a column for the type of microbe, and then a column for how any details you found out about it, things like how it spreads, what it's like, and so on. So I want some notes on each of these, basically. Okay, I'm going to stop there because I've talked to you for far too long. There's a video to watch at the start, a 4-minute video when I've put that onto ePraise. Make sure you watch that. Make sure you've gone through this PowerPoint and rewind it anywhere you need to if you need to repeat any of it. Make sure you have notes on each of these microbes, and make sure you know, for example, what causes these, how it's spread, how it's passed on, how long the illness lasts for, all sorts of information like that you can have in your notes. Right, I'm going to stop. I'm just double checking I've got everything I want to talk to you about. I know I have gone on a long time, so I am really sorry. On Friday, we'll carry on with pathogens, and we'll have a look at some in a bit more detail. So watch the first video, watch my video making notes as you go of bacteria, fungi, viruses, and so on. Make some brief notes of what they are, draw a diagram if you want to, and then we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different microbes. Some are bacteria, some are caused by viruses, these guys here, fungus, protozoa. So I want you to write some facts for each one. Okay? I will speak to you again on Friday. Take care.